Today we are going to discuss the unpaired t-test, or the t-test for independent means. In the previous lecture, we discussed the general null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis for the comparison of the mean values, that if we are interested in comparing the mean values of the two groups or the two populations, then what is our general null hypothesis or what is our general alternate hypothesis. And then we also discussed different concepts, like we discussed the concept of the unmatched and matched observations. The unmatched observations are the unpaired observations, and the matched observations are the paired observations. And we saw the difference between these two types of observations with different examples, and there are two different types of the t-test which are used for these two types of the observations. And then we discussed that the observations, they should have a normal distribution. So our observations, they should be normally distributed. Our data should have a normal distribution if we want to carry out the t-test, or if we want to compare the mean values of the two groups. And then we discussed another concept about the homogeneity of variances. So this concept is that the variances of the two groups that we are going to compare the mean values of, so variances of these two groups, they should be same. So the population variances, they should be same if we want to carry out the t-test, and this is a requirement for the unpaired t-test, or the t-test for independent means. And this homogeneity of variances can be checked through a simple variance ratio, which is calculated through the f-test. So f-test is a simple variance ratio in which the greater variance is divided by the lesser variance, and if the ratio of the two variances, it is significantly greater than unity, then we should not perform the t-test. So in order for the homogeneity of variances to be similar, this value of the f, it should be non-significantly different from 1. So if our variances are non-significantly different from each other, then we can proceed for the t-test. So today we are going to discuss the unpaired t-test, which is a t-test for independent means, or for the unmatched means. So this t-test is used for comparing the means of samples from two separate populations or groups. So as its name indicates, that this is the test for two unpaired or the unmatched groups, two independent groups. So in this case, we are going to have two independent populations, and we are going to compare the means of the samples from these two separate populations or groups. So this is the purpose of using the unpaired t-test. And this t-test is also known as the independent t-test, or the independent measures t-test, independent two-sample t-test, and the student's t-test. So this is quite the famous name for this test, the student's t-test. That is the most familiar name for this unpaired t-test. And then it is also known as the unpaired t-test and the unrelated t-test. So these are the different names for the same statistic, for the same test, which is the t-test for independent means, and this t-test is used for comparing the mean values of two different populations or two different groups, which are measured for the same variable. So this unpaired t-test, it is used for calculating the statistical differences between the means of two groups. For example, the mean height of conifers between two regions. So let's suppose we have measured the height of conifers from two different regions, from two different populations, and we want to compare the mean height of these two groups. Then we are going to apply the unpaired t-test. Why this is unpaired? Because these are observations from two different regions, and the observations, they are not related to each other. And it is also used for calculating the statistical differences between the means of two interventions. For example, the plankton diversity under two different pH ranges. For example, if we have two water bodies which have different pH ranges, and if we want to compare the plankton density from these two different water bodies, then we are going to apply the t-test for independent means. And why this specific t-test? Because these observations, they are taken from two different populations. So these are the general conditions in which the unpaired t-test, or the t-test for independent means, is used. Now, what are the requirements for the t-test? So the foremost requirement is that the two samples should be independent from each other. So as it is evident from the name of this t-test that it is the t-test for independent means or the unpaired means, so it means that the samples, they should be two independent samples. So it means that the observations, they should be independent of each other. So there should be an independence of observations. So the observations in each of these two groups, they should have no relationship with each other. And there should be no relationship between units as well in each sample. So units in the sample, they should be also independent of each other. And there should be no overlap of units between the two groups. So there should be no overlap, and the units in the in both of the groups, they should be exclusive. For example, if we have taken observation from one unit, we are not going to take the same observation, or we are not going to measure the same variable and place that observation into the other group. So these units, they should be exclusive. They can be placed only in one of the groups. So we cannot take observations from one sampling unit for both of the groups. So one unit should be placed only in one of the groups. They should be exclusive. Then no unit in either group can influence units in the other group. So there should be no influence of observations taken from one unit on the observations taken from the other. Or if we are doing an intervention, then there should be no influence of one unit on the other unit. And similarly, there should be no influence of one group on the other. So the two independent sample means that the samples, they should be totally independent, which starts from the population level, that the two groups or the two populations, they should be totally independent or unrelated to each other. And then coming to the sampling units, they also should be independent of each other. They should not be related to each other, and one unit should not influence another unit within the same group or in the other group. And then the observations, they should also be independent of each other. So the two samples, they should be totally independent if we want to carry out the unpaired T-test. The other requirements for the unpaired T-test are that this test can be applied on the data which is obtained from measurement of continuous variable. So we cannot use this T-test on the discrete data, or we cannot use this kind of the T-test on the data which is on the nominal scale or the ordinal scale. So we can use this type of T-test on the continuous variable which is measured on interval or ratio scale. And then the and then the requirement that we discussed in the last lecture is that the data should be normally distributed. The observations, they should have a normal distribution. And why is that so? So that we can apply the principles of critical probability to an accurate extent. And then the homogeneity of variances between the two groups, that the variances of the variable that we are measuring, that variance should be identical in both of the study groups. And then the two groups, they should have almost similar sample size. So this test is quite flexible, so it allows the two samples to have a different size. So the number of observations in the two groups, that could be different, but that difference should not be a huge difference. So there should not be a huge difference in the sample size of the two groups, and the small differences, they are allowed. So this test is quite flexible in that sense, that you can have different observations from the two groups, different number of observations from the two groups. So these are the requirements of the unpaired T-test. So unless and until you meet all these requirements, you cannot have the precise calculation or precise result of the T-test. You can do the calculations, you can carry out the analysis, but that analysis is not going to be a precise or accurate analysis. So these requirements, they should be met before you are applying the student's T-test, which is the T-test for independent means.